The cabin was a perfect picture of control, so flawless, so still. It seemed suspended in time. The low hum of the engines filled the air, distant but constant, like a pulse beneath the skin of the aircraft. It reverberated through the plush leather seats and thick carpeting, creating a subdued vibration that was felt more than heard. The overhead lights flickered with cold precision, casting an almost artificial glow across the first-class section. It was sterile, too bright, the kind of light that strips away warmth and leaves nothing but clarity. No shadows, no depth, just white, hollow surfaces and the careful, controlled quiet that followed. The air, though, was thick, too thick. Every inch of the cabin was designed for perfection, but something was off. The passengers, all self-contained in their own private worlds, tried to ignore it. The woman in 2C read her book with mechanical precision. The man in 3A typed relentlessly into his laptop, their faces locked in a kind of passive engagement with their screens. No one dared to make eye contact. No one spoke. Each person caught in the quiet dance of avoidance. But their bodies told another story. Tight shoulders, restless feet, fingers tapping or drumming without rhythm, as if the stillness was pushing against them, forcing them into an uncomfortable awareness of the air around them. Then a sound, soft yet definitive.
The click of a seatbelt. It wasn't loud, certainly not enough to break the heavy silence, but in that moment, it was as if the entire cabin collectively flinched. A quiet but unmistakable break in the routine, in the endless stillness. The sound was an interruption, but more than that, it was a signal, a subtle promise that something was coming. The woman had just taken her seat, her movements slow, deliberate, as if she too could feel the tension growing, like a thread stretched too tight. Kendra Washington, the source of this new rhythm. She hadn't said a word. She didn't need to. As she fastened her seatbelt, the click seemed to echo. It rang through the cabin, a sound so ordinary, yet it sliced through the thick, stagnant air. And for just a moment, the hum of the engines, the soft shuffle of newspapers, the tapping of keyboards, all faded into the background. The world outside the plane, frozen, suspended, seemed far away, and all that was left was the confined space around them. The hum of the engines seemed louder now, more oppressive. The calm that had reigned felt suffocating, a bubble about to burst. Her eyes swept the cabin, calm, controlled, but with a hardness beneath them. She was aware of the discomfort, the unease, the quiet tension building like static in the air. The passengers, despite their efforts, could feel it too. The stillness of the plane was no longer just a setting, it was becoming a pressure chamber. The hum of the engines wasn't comforting anymore, it was oppressive, as though every vibration in the air was carrying something heavier, something unseen but undeniable. The quiet lingered, like the calm before a storm, thick with anticipation. A moment stretched, almost too long, before the first flicker of movement, a slight twitch of the hand, a brief glance exchanged between strangers who hadn't spoken a word. And still, no one moved, no one dared to, until it was shattered. The silence wasn't a break, it was a fracture.
Kendra's movement was slow, deliberate, yet it seemed to snap the cabin to attention. Her gaze settled on the flight attendant moving toward her, almost imperceptible, but just enough for the tension to sharpen, like the first crack of ice beneath pressure. The soft hum of the engines never stopped, but now it felt too loud, too close. And for the briefest moment, the passengers all held their breath. This was no longer just a flight. It was a moment suspended between the ordinary and the explosive, and everything was about to crack wide open. Thank you for sticking around with me, my wonderful story family. If you're already hooked in for today's story and ready to enjoy it, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because tomorrow I will be giving you another story just as interesting as this one, and you don't want to miss it. Now let us begin.
Kendra Washington sank into her seat as if she were descending into something much deeper than mere leather and fabric. Every movement was measured, deliberate, as though she were navigating through a carefully orchestrated moment. The crisp folds of her tailored suit brushed the armrest in a perfectly calculated arc. Even in a moment as simple as sitting down, she exuded an unspoken authority, the kind that didn't need to be announced. It was ingrained in her every fiber. Her fingers brushed the smooth surface of her Birkin bag, a symbol of both success and survival, luxury and weapon, depending on the world you chose to see. She glanced at her phone screen, eyes briefly flicking over the updates from her team. Texts, strategic, business-driven, logistical. Nothing that mattered in this moment. Yet even as she skimmed them, she felt the weight of every word. It wasn't just about what they said. It was about who sent them. Her. Kendra didn't just hold the reins of Washington Aerospace. She held the reins of a space that many people couldn't even imagine entering. She was the one who built it, piece by piece, out of sheer grit and calculated moves. Her calmness? It wasn't the kind you just learn or adopt in passing. It wasn't born out of practice, though practice certainly helped. It came from a deeper place, years spent navigating boardrooms where no one ever made it easy, a mind constantly under pressure. She had faced giants and seen them fall with nothing more than a quiet word, a well-timed offer. No one in that room, or this cabin, knew what it had taken to get there, but she did. Her gaze shifted from the phone, landing on the flight attendant making her way down the aisle, a figure that disrupted the sterile stillness of the cabin. Kendra's eyes followed the movement, slow and deliberate. She didn't need to look away from the attendant. It wasn't fear, but something subtler, deeper. Awareness. She was keenly aware that this wasn't her space to control. Not yet. Not unless she decided to take it.
There was a slight twitch in her hand as it rested on the armrest. No one could see it. Not the woman with her head down in the seat ahead, not the businessman in the window seat, nor the others scattered in the surrounding rows. But Kendra knew. She had always known. This wasn't just a flight. This was a negotiation, an arena, an environment of control and chaos, a battleground where the invisible rules were about to be tested. She could feel it tightening in her chest, that familiar sensation that told her that, once again, she was going to have to take back what was hers, even if it meant walking through a storm. This wasn't the first time she'd been caught in a space like this, an environment where the rules were arbitrary, where people like her were constantly measured against invisible standards. Her armor, the calmness, the unshakable stillness, it wasn't just about maintaining dignity, it was about surviving. It was about showing no weakness, no fear. She'd learned early that in a world where you were constantly underestimated, the quietest move was often the most dangerous. And the thing about Kendra was that she wasn't just a survivor. She was a creator, a builder of her own world. She folded her hands, fingertips lightly pressing against the soft surface of the seat's armrest. A flicker of tension tightened in her jaw, again, so slight, so imperceptible that it would have gone unnoticed by anyone but her. She wasn't angry, she wasn't scared, but she was always preparing. Years of navigating this kind of pressure, of discomfort, had taught her to be perpetually on guard. She knew that people like her were always being tested, always being watched, always being measured against impossible standards. And so she remained unmoved, even when the world around her shifted. The flight attendant continued her approach, slow, almost too slow, intentional. A subtle tilt in Kendra's posture indicated that she was no longer just sitting back, she was becoming aware of the movement in the cabin, the quiet but deliberate steps taken by someone else. There was power in stillness. In motion, you could lose everything, but stillness, Kendra had learned, was control. She exhaled, a faint hint of a smile pulling at the corners of her mouth. Her eyes never left the attendant, who had now passed the row, only to slow down when she reached Kendra's seat. The slightest pause hung in the air. The attendant's eyes lingered on Kendra, just a fraction too long for comfort. That's when Kendra's fingers tightened ever so slightly on the armrest, an imperceptible shift in her body language signaling that this was no ordinary encounter. She wasn't just a woman sitting on a plane. She was a force of nature, poised, untouchable, like the quiet before the storm.
Her gaze locked with the attendant's. It wasn't hostile. It wasn't challenging. It was commanding. Kendra Washington didn't need to shout her authority. She didn't need to raise her voice. Her presence, the weight of the quiet years spent proving her worth, spoke for itself. Kendra's world was one of influence and manipulation of power, but the power wasn't in loud words, in bold gestures. It was in the smallest movements, the clenched grip on the armrest, the controlled exhale, the unblinking stare that sent a message without saying a word. The attendant hesitated, then went on with her duties. She hadn't expected that kind of presence. She hadn't expected Kendra, not in this space. But Kendra knew how to make her presence felt in every room. Even in the most quiet, sterile spaces, she was a force. Jenna Williams stepped into the aisle with a presence that almost demanded attention. Tall, with sharp features, and an air of unwavering self-assurance, she moved like someone who had never been challenged, her heels clicking steadily against the carpet, as though marking the rhythm of a song only she knew. Her posture was straight, deliberately so, but there was an underlying tension in her movements, like a predator who had been watching too long, but had never been questioned. She spotted Kendra immediately, standing by the window, her dark eyes scanning the cabin with quiet intensity. Jenna's gaze flicked to Kendra, sharp and assessing. For a split second, something flashed behind her eyes, an almost imperceptible shift as she took in Kendra's presence, her composure, her calm, and the unspoken challenge it represented. It wasn't the first time Jenna had met someone with that unshakable confidence, but it was rare. And even rarer was the way Kendra seemed to exist within that confidence, as though the air around her had been forged through years of holding her ground. Jenna looked down at Kendra's first-class ticket, then back up to her face. The words came naturally, but this time there was something beneath them. She tilted her head slightly, the edge of her smile sharp but forced, a perfect mask hiding a momentary flicker of something else. Uncertainty, maybe. But she smothered it quickly. She didn't need to be vulnerable. Not now.
First class, huh? The words were cold, a dismissal wrapped in sweet mockery. Sorry, sweetheart, but this isn't welfare seating. First class is for people who can actually afford it. Her smile never reached her eyes, but it wasn't just disdain that she projected, it was entitlement. She had a way of talking, a cadence that made it clear she was used to seeing herself at the top of the hierarchy, never questioned, always affirmed. People like her belonged here. She had earned the right to speak that way, to assume the space she occupied was inherently hers, and anyone who didn't know that was simply out of place, a glitch in the system. But in the second it took Kendra to look up at her, that same self-assurance, that sense of authority Jenna carried with her everywhere, began to waver. For just a fraction of a moment, Jenna's gaze flickered, a crack in the otherwise polished shield she wore. It wasn't a noticeable shift, not to the casual observer, but it was there. Something subtle in the way her jaw tightened, the way her fingers gripped the drink cart a bit too hard. The air between them thickened, and for the first time in years, Jenna felt the edge of discomfort creep in. Kendra hadn't moved a muscle, her posture still as precise and unyielding as before. Her eyes, dark and unreadable, remained locked on Jenna. And it was that silence, that stillness that rattled her more than anything. Jenna wasn't accustomed to being measured, to being looked at with no judgment, as though she were merely another presence in the room. Most people reacted to her, laughed at her jokes, nodded in agreement, moved out of her way. But Kendra was different. There was no movement, no flicker of acknowledgement, just a steady, unfaltering gaze. Jenna felt herself lean slightly forward, her body instinctively taking on a more aggressive stance. She was used to dominating conversations like this. Her words, sharp and quick, were meant to break the ice, to reduce the unknown into something she could control. But this was different. She felt the smallest flicker of unease in the pit of her stomach. Why wasn't Kendra reacting? Why wasn't she shifting, shrinking, as people usually did when Jenna spoke to them that way? Her mind raced, but Jenna didn't let it show. The smile returned, but it was tight, practiced. "What's the matter, sweetie? Not used to sitting up here?" She tilted her head again, narrowing her eyes just a fraction more. She had to take control. The words came quickly, each one with a little more force, a little more venom. But still, Kendra didn't flinch. Not even a breath of reaction. The stillness in her only grew. And that was the problem.
Kendra's calm was not some pretense or passive acceptance. It was power. And it wasn't the kind of power that screamed or demanded attention. It simply existed. The silence between them was more oppressive than any sharp remark Jenna could have made. It was a weight Jenna had never had to carry, not in the corporate meetings she ruled, not in the rooms where everyone knew her name. Here, in this small, confined space, Kendra was the one commanding attention without saying a word. The first-class cabin, which Jenna had always seen as a space of control, wasn't hers anymore. Jenna's thoughts scrambled, but the mask stayed in place. She opened her mouth again, prepared to make another remark, to reassert her dominance in some small way, but the words never came. For the first time, Jenna wasn't sure what to say. She wasn't just dealing with a passenger who didn't understand the rules. She was dealing with someone who had already made the rules irrelevant. Her grip on the drink cart tightened, her knuckles whitening, but the tightness in her chest didn't loosen. She quickly looked away, pretending to adjust her uniform, but the tremor in her hand didn't go unnoticed. Kendra had seen it. She didn't have to say anything. She didn't have to act. Kendra's presence alone was enough to make the entire cabin feel like it was closing in, the quiet stillness swallowing Jenna whole. Jenna Williams stood motionless, her posture straight, but there was something in her eyes, something shifting. The air between her and Kendra had thickened, a palpable tension, as though the entire cabin had collectively taken a breath. Jenna was used to having the upper hand. It wasn't just her position, her job, or her appearance that gave her power. It was the way people saw her. She walked into rooms and people moved. They shifted. They adjusted themselves to fit her presence. It had always been that way, and she had come to believe that it always would be.
But here, in this narrow aisle, in the world Kendra had silently claimed, Jenna felt it, the slightest crack in her armor. She was facing someone who didn't flinch, who didn't cower. Kendra's composure was not an act. It wasn't a show for the world. It was an unspoken defiance, a quiet strength that challenged Jenna's view of power. The subtle tension in Kendra's stillness made Jenna feel, for the first time, like she wasn't the one in control, and Jenna couldn't have that. Her fingers wrapped tighter around the cart's handle, her grip tightening to something almost painful. Her knuckles went white, but she didn't let go. She was a woman of action, of power, and she was going to make sure that the tension between them didn't slip away unnoticed. No one made her feel small. Not like this. Not here. Jenna's lips curled into a smile, but it wasn't warm. It wasn't playful. It was calculated. A smile designed to mask the flicker of uncertainty that flitted across her mind. Her eyes, however, betrayed her. For a split second, they widened imperceptibly. A quick flash of something. Vulnerability, maybe? But she caught it, forced it back down. She straightened her shoulders, and the smile became sharper, more pointed. She didn't just want control anymore, she needed it. "First class, huh?" The words spilled out like a command, but underneath the surface there was something else, a quiet desperation, a drive to regain the upper hand. "Sorry, sweetheart, but this isn't welfare seating. First class is for people who can actually afford it." Her voice was clipped, sharp, the kind of tone people usually took when they wanted to prove something, when they were unsure but too proud to show it. The air in the cabin felt heavier now, pressing down on everyone, not just Jenna. Passengers began shifting in their seats, the rustle of fabric, the quiet click of a phone being turned off, as if the atmosphere itself had become unbearable. Jenna had always been able to command attention, even in rooms full of people. But this was different. Kendra wasn't afraid of her. Kendra wasn't reacting the way people were supposed to. Kendra stood still, her gaze unwavering, calm. But in the calm, there was a storm. The stillness in Kendra's body, the deliberate and silent power she radiated, made it impossible for Jenna to escape the feeling that she was no longer the one holding the strings. It wasn't just that Kendra wasn't reacting, it was the calm certainty in her presence that made Jenna feel exposed. She was the one now fighting for control. But she wouldn't back down. No one had ever made her feel small, not like this. She took a step closer, her feet clicking a little too loudly on the plush carpet, just to assert her presence. This wasn't about the seat anymore. This wasn't about the conversation. This was about her need to dominate. She pulled out her phone quickly, her fingers shaking slightly as they found the camera button, but she didn't hesitate. The cold glass of her phone became her shield, the lens between her and Kendra. Her thumb hovered over the record button for a split second, just enough time to realize what she was doing. This was no longer just a confrontation. This was going to be a spectacle. Kendra hadn't spoken, hadn't moved, and that was the moment that tipped Jenna over the edge. She wasn't just a woman trying to take her seat. She was someone who had just defied her, and Jenna wasn't going to let that slide. Not when she had a way to regain the upper hand.
David Brooks sat near the front, his gaze flickering between the two women. He had been a passive observer up until now, his eyes flitting between Kendra and Jenna, the tension settling like dust in the air. But as the confrontation unfolded, David felt something change in the room. It wasn't just the sharpness of Jenna's words, it was the stillness in Kendra's eyes, the calm power that radiated outward. David had lived his life in front of a screen, consuming stories, watching drama unfold in 140 characters or less, but now he was a part of it, right in the middle of it, watching something real unfold. His fingers hovered above his phone, the device in his lap now weighing heavier than before. The curiosity burned in his chest, the temptation to record, to capture this, to be part of the moment. It wasn't moral obligation, it was something else, something fleeting, something he couldn't quite place. His mind raced. Was he just a spectator, or was he complicit in this? He knew how easy it was to get wrapped up in the spectacle of things, to lose sight of what really mattered and focus only on the click, the like, the view count. The thought that this moment, this tension could go viral, that it could become something more than just a passing argument, was enough to nudge him into action. His phone screen flickered on, the soft glow illuminating his face as his thumb hovered, ready to capture this uncomfortable reality for the world to see. Meanwhile, Maria Santos couldn't look away, but she didn't want to be seen looking. The tension in the air felt suffocating, and her stomach turned with it. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her hand clenching the armrest as though trying to anchor herself in place, to remain invisible in this moment of growing chaos. She didn't want to get involved. She had never liked confrontation, never been one to pick sides. But this felt different, uncomfortable, wrong. Her gaze flicked toward Margaret Thompson, who was leaning forward, her eyes narrowing at the exchange unfolding between Kendra and Jenna. Margaret whispered something to her husband, but the words were not meant for him. They were for herself, a truth that she spoke so softly, but so bitterly. "It's always the same," Margaret murmured, barely audible over the soft hum of the engines. "The rules are there to be bent for some, broken for others." Her words, as quiet as they were, hung in the air like a cloud of smoke, leaving a resonance that felt heavier than it should. The truth, as bitter as it was, seemed to settle into the cabin, creeping into the cracks where people had tried to ignore it. Margaret wasn't just commenting on what was happening, she was commenting on the reality of the world around them, the imbalance, the systems in place that allowed one person to walk through life unquestioned, while the other constantly had to fight to be seen as worthy.
The silence after Margaret's whisper was like an echo that resonated in the ears of every passenger. No one said anything, but it was clear the rules were not made equal. They never had been. And that realization settled into the cabin, thick and undeniable. The tension in the cabin was unbearable now, thick, suffocating, the air pregnant with unspoken words. Jenna stood still for a beat too long, eyes locked on Kendra, as if waiting for something to give, for her to show some sign of weakness or discomfort. But Kendra didn't move. She didn't blink. She didn't flinch. It was as though time itself had taken a slow breath, holding its air in for just a second too long. And in that second, Jenna's voice cut through the oppressive quiet like a razor blade, sharper, harder than it had been before, slicing through the tension with chilling ease. "This isn't the place for freeloaders, sweetheart," she spat, her words so sharp they felt like a slap in themselves. There was a mocking edge to her tone, a calculated sneer, but underneath the faintest tremor of uncertainty. A flicker of something she tried to suppress, but Kendra's unbroken calm seemed to draw it out of her. The bite in her voice wasn't just aimed at Kendra, it was at herself, too, a self-defense mechanism that had been honed for years. It was the only way she knew how to survive, assertion through force. The words had barely left her lips when she raised her hand, her wrist flicking out with a suddenness that was almost imperceptible at first. It wasn't a slap, not quite, not yet. The movement was quick, precise. It was meant to degrade, to assert control in the smallest of ways. Her fingers brushed against Kendra's first-class ticket, the cool paper slipping out of Kendra's grip as Jenna flicked it away with a practiced motion, as though this was just another small defeat she could claim. But the impact wasn't physical, it was psychological.
The flick of the wrist felt like it echoed throughout the cabin, reverberating through the space between them. Kendra's chest tightened, but not out of fear. It wasn't fear. It was a strange sensation, a rush of energy, a kind of clarity. The kind of clarity she had learned to recognize in herself years ago, in rooms far more volatile than this one. The cabin around them seemed to disappear for just a moment. The hum of the engines faded into the background, like it was no longer there at all. The soft click of a seatbelt in the distance, the subtle rustling of newspapers, all became distant sounds, drowned out by the sting of the air. Time moved in slow motion, as if the impact of the moment, the flick of the wrist, the sting of Jenna's action, had frozen everything. The silence was deafening. The slap hadn't come yet, but the buildup was enough. It felt like an explosion, held in check by the quiet intensity of the cabin. And then, in the middle of this taut stillness, the slap came. It wasn't loud. It wasn't an explosion of noise. It was sharp, like a gunshot in a vacant room. It wasn't the force that made it land so heavily. It was the weight of it, the finality. It was the sound of something breaking. It reverberated through Kendra's ears, hollow, ringing, as if the world had shattered and no one had noticed. Her breath caught in her chest, but her eyes never left Jenna. Kendra didn't flinch. She didn't react. She stood perfectly still, her gaze steady, unwavering. She wasn't the kind of person who responded with rash emotion. Not anymore. Not now. She didn't need to. The moment was burning into the space, each second dragging, stretching out. And as the slap settled, so did something else. The realization that this moment of violence, of humiliation, was not the one that would define her.
Kendra wasn't worried about the slap. She wasn't worried about the humiliation. She was thinking about what came after. She was already plotting her next move. But all of this, every ounce of control she held, would be delivered quietly, like the calm before a storm. Jenna's phone was in her hand before the sting of the slap had fully settled. She snapped it up, fingers moving quickly, almost mechanically, the screen glowing coldly in the dim light of the cabin. It wasn't just a reflex. It was a signal, her way of turning the moment into something she could control. The camera clicked on, the screen flooding with light as she pointed it at Kendra, capturing the aftermath of her power. "Laugh, everyone. First-class drama right here," Jenna said, her voice now far too loud, almost too eager, as though she was forcing herself to remain in control. The words spilled from her mouth with a twisted grin, but there was something missing in them, something desperate. Jenna didn't see it, but everyone else did. Her confidence, once so sharp and unshakable, was now frayed at the edges. She zoomed in on Kendra's face, the lens capturing every inch of her, as though Jenna believed this moment would be her victory, the thing that proved she was still in control, still above it all. But as she zoomed in, something changed on Kendra's face, something that Jenna wasn't ready for. Kendra's face, still and calm, wasn't twisted in anger or frustration. It wasn't the immediate reaction Jenna had been hoping for. Instead, there was something colder there, something more dangerous. It wasn't fear. It wasn't weakness. It was rage, but it was the kind of rage that was held in check, buried beneath layers of quiet resolve. And it was that rage, that stillness, that Jenna couldn't comprehend.
Kendra was calculating. She was already thinking beyond this slap, beyond this moment. She was already moving past it, plotting her next move in a way that Jenna couldn't possibly follow. Jenna's smile faltered. It was small, barely perceptible, but it was there. Her grip on the phone tightened. Something inside her began to slip. She had wanted to break Kendra, to humiliate her, to make her shrink in front of everyone. But Kendra wasn't shrinking. She was growing, transforming this moment into something else entirely. David Brooks, who had been sitting quietly in the front row, felt something shift in him the moment the slap landed. He hadn't intended to get involved, hadn't expected to feel the weight of it, but now he did. His fingers trembled as he continued to hold the phone, his camera still recording, but now with a sense of unease. At first it had been curiosity, a desire to capture the moment, to be a passive observer. But now, watching the situation unfold, the tension in the air seemed to settle on his shoulders like a weight he hadn't prepared for. Had he crossed a line by recording this? Was he complicit in the violence, or was he just another spectator? He felt a wave of guilt, fleeting but sharp, but the lure of the viral clip pulled at him, and he hesitated, his finger hovering over the button again. He wasn't sure anymore whether he was watching or participating. Meanwhile, Maria Santos, her fingers gripping the edge of her seat, stared at the exchange with growing discomfort. She had stayed quiet, invisible, as she had always had, but the weight of the moment was too much. She wanted to shrink away, to distance herself from the scene, but the truth of what was happening,
the power dynamics, the tension made her skin crawl. She had witnessed injustice before, but this felt different. This wasn't a quiet injustice. This was blatant, inescapable. Margaret Thompson, on the other hand, leaned forward, her eyes narrowed, her lips pressed tight together. She had heard enough, seen enough, to know exactly what was going on. The rules always bent for some, broken for others. It was an unspoken truth, but it was clear now. Jenna had crossed a line, and Kendra, the woman who had always been othered, was showing the world just how deep that line went. Margaret's quiet mutterings, her words too soft for anyone but her husband to hear, settled like a curse in the air. The cabin was eerily silent now. As Jenna's phone glowed coldly in her hand, the only sound that could be heard was the low hum of the engines. But even that felt muffled, distant, as if the space around them had grown too thick with the weight of what had just happened. The PA announcement in the distance only seemed to punctuate the silence, an unwelcome intrusion. Every soft click, every small rustle of clothing now felt louder, sharper. The click of smartphones, the ticking of the overhead clock, the soft murmurs of passengers shifting in their seats. The sound amplified the unease. The entire cabin seemed on edge, caught in the aftermath of a single moment of violence, each person's internal struggle writ large across their faces. The cabin seemed to shrink as Kendra rose from her seat, her movement slow, almost deliberate, as though she were feeling the weight of every step she took. The air around her seemed to shift, like the room itself was becoming aware of her presence, an energy radiating outward, quietly unyielding. Her spine was straight, her movements fluid, as though she had just made a decision not just to stand, but to take control of the moment, of everything. There was nothing dramatic about it. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't make grand gestures. Kendra didn't need to. Her stillness was a force in itself. Every muscle in her body seemed locked in a perfect posture of composure, an image of absolute control that somehow made the entire cabin feel smaller. Her presence wasn't one of confrontation. It was the kind of quiet strength that drew people in without them even realizing it. She didn't need to assert power. She embodied it. Jenna had fired her words like daggers, hoping to force Kendra into a corner. But Kendra didn't flinch. She didn't move. She simply met the challenge with calm. And in that calm, everything Jenna had built, her arrogance, her hostility, started to seem hollow. With a slight turn of her head, Kendra's gaze fixed on the captain, who had been lingering nearby, seemingly caught in the gravity of what had just transpired. The flight attendant had been hesitant, almost frozen in place, unsure whether to step in. But Kendra's presence, unspoken yet palpable, moved past the crew, past the passengers who had been silently watching, and locked onto the captain with the kind of focus that made him pause, made him reconsider the next step. "Verify my ticket." Kendra's voice was soft, but every syllable carried the weight of authority. There was no anger, no challenge, just quiet insistence, a command wrapped in the calm of someone who had been in control of her circumstances for far longer than anyone in this room realized.
His gaze dropped, and with a quiet nod, the captain signaled to the attendant to verify Kendra's ticket. And just like that, the dynamic in the cabin shifted. The game had changed. Kendra wasn't just a passenger anymore. She was the center of the room, even though she never had to raise her voice. The cabin, once alive with murmurs and shifting bodies, seemed to pause. The passengers weren't just witnessing an interaction, they were witnessing the moment of power. Kendra hadn't shouted. She hadn't argued. She had simply moved through the room with the kind of calm confidence that demanded compliance. Jenna's eyes followed the captain's nod, her breath catching for just a moment. The shift was undeniable, and in the pit of her stomach, something twisted. She had thought she was in control of this situation, that her presence, her words, would be enough to break Kendra, to force her into submission. But instead, it felt like Kendra had already won, without ever speaking. Her fingers tightened around her phone, the cool surface suddenly feeling slippery in her grasp. Her confidence, once so unwavering, was starting to feel flimsy, like the ground beneath her was eroding bit by bit. The phone, which had once been a weapon, a tool to capture the moment and turn it to her advantage, now felt like an anchor she couldn't hold on to. Her reflection on the screen flickered back at her, the familiar sharp lines of her face suddenly seeming foreign. Her smile, once a mask of control, was now stretched tight, her eyes darting over the cabin, catching the looks of passengers who were no longer on her side. They had seen it. They had seen the way Kendra didn't flinch, the way she held the room without ever needing to raise her voice. And now, those passengers weren't just witnesses. They were seeing the cracks in her armor, seeing her vulnerabilities exposed for the first time. Jenna blinked, but her reflection remained. Her lips were tight, the lines of her face suddenly showing something she didn't want to acknowledge: self-doubt. She had been playing this game all along, thinking she could twist the narrative, that she could force the situation to fit her own definition of power. But now it was slipping away, and she couldn't stop it. The phone, the tool of control, now felt like it was mocking her. Her fingers twitched, as if they might drop it, but she gripped it tighter, determined to capture something, anything, that could help her regain the narrative. But it wasn't working. The image on the screen, the distorted reflection of herself, was only a reminder of how far she had gone wrong. Jenna could feel the stares. The eyes of the passengers were no longer just spectators to a fleeting drama. They were judging, and she could feel it. Her smile, the one she had forced so many times, faded completely. Her jaw tightened, a brief flicker of panic crossing her face before she regained composure, just enough to mask it. But the damage was done. Kendra's silent strength had cracked something deep within her, and the mask that had always shielded Jenna's insecurities was starting to slip. The cabin had grown stiller, the weight of what was happening pressing down on each passenger like a dense fog. The movement of the crew, the small sounds of the plane, all faded into the background as the true gravity of the situation began to set in. Everyone was now witnessing something that went beyond a simple confrontation. It was a battle of power and control, and the moment seemed to hold them in its grip.
David Brooks, still sitting near the front, had been watching the exchange unfold from the moment it began. He had initially taken the stance of a detached observer, his phone out of instinct, not moral duty. But now that feeling had changed. He had felt the shift, the subtle power dynamic that had suddenly swung Kendra's way. David felt himself pulled in, but there was discomfort in that. This wasn't a moment for casual observation. It wasn't something that could simply be recorded and brushed aside. His fingers lingered on the record button, but the hesitation grew. What had once seemed like an opportunity to capture a dramatic moment now felt uncomfortably invasive. He wasn't sure anymore if he was just observing or part of the situation. His phone, once a tool to capture, now felt more like a burden. He couldn't look away, but the weight of his own role in this moment was starting to settle on him. Across the aisle, Maria Santos could feel her pulse quickening. The quiet unease in the air, the growing tension was something she could feel in her bones. She shifted in her seat, gripping the armrest, trying to hold herself steady. Her initial apathy, the desire to stay out of this drama, was beginning to melt away, replaced by a growing awareness. She wasn't just a bystander. She could see it now, the imbalance between Jenna's aggressions and Kendra's silent power, and it made her uncomfortable in ways she didn't want to acknowledge. Her eyes flicked nervously toward Margaret Thompson, who, despite sitting beside her husband, had leaned forward, her gaze locked on the scene unfolding. Margaret was the type of person who saw beyond the surface, and Maria could sense the disgust beginning to form on her face.
"It's always the same," Margaret whispered to her husband, her words carrying a bitter truth. "The rules are there to be bent for some, broken for others." Maria felt the weight of her words settle over her. Margaret wasn't just commenting on what was happening. She was commenting on the larger systemic truth, the unspoken inequality that existed in every room, every space. The privileges of some, the marginalization of others. The fact that Jenna's authority had been based on her privilege, and now here, in this small space, that privilege was no longer enough. The digital world exploded. The first few comments were small, barely noticeable, flickering up on David's live feed like sparks from a fire waiting to catch. Who is she? What did she do? That flight attendant is out of line. But in the space of mere seconds, the feed was swamped. Comments were flooding in, too fast to keep up with. David's phone screen, glowing bright in the dim cabin, flickered like a living thing, consuming the entire moment in its cold, unrelenting glow. The comments tumbled into the screen, tumbling over one another. And within that flood, the language quickly shifted from curiosity to outrage, instant, loud, pervasive. It was no longer just a recording of an argument, it was a movement, a story that had escaped the confines of the plane and was now alive in the world. The speed with which the conversation shifted was unsettling. The internet was a beast, and now it had a name, a face, and a new purpose.
And Kendra? Kendra sat there, her expression still. Stillness had become her shield. Her gaze never wavered, never flickered towards the frenzy that was brewing beyond the glass of her phone screen. The storm of digital chatter, the dissection of every word and every movement, it didn't matter. It wasn't hers to play in. She had already made the decision. This wasn't going to be a spectacle about her, it was about justice, a fight for what was right, for what had been done to her, and for what had been done to countless others who had been silently silenced. Her stillness was not indifference. It was the deliberate choice to not engage in the noise, the chaos, the spectacle that others were so eager to build around her. She wasn't about to play into their hands. She wasn't interested in becoming a meme or a hashtag. This was about something bigger than the viral moment, the fight for respect, for recognition in a world that often didn't see the quiet strength it took to navigate every day. But outside, the digital storm raged. Hashtag Justice for Kendra began to trend. It wasn't just about a slap anymore. It was about resistance. It was about a system that made some people shrink and others stand tall. No matter what. Every tweet, every retweet, every post that followed began to build a narrative, a force bigger than any of them could control. David's fingers hovered over the screen, and in that brief moment of hesitation, the weight of the phone became too much to bear. The bright glow of the screen had taken on a new significance, as if the camera had become something he couldn't escape, something that had become an extension of his conscience. Every swipe, every tap, every comment now felt like a heavy responsibility,
a burden he wasn't prepared for. He hadn't expected this. It was just supposed to be a moment, a quick video to share, a quick drama to consume. But this felt like something else entirely.
The first comment, "Who is she?" was a passing question, a curiosity. But now, as the feed scrolled with the rising tide of opinions, it was clear. He wasn't just recording something. He was participating in something that was taking on a life of its own. His decision to record this moment had irrevocably changed the narrative. He wasn't just observing anymore. The phone, once a tool to document, now felt like a mirror reflecting his complicity. He glanced around the cabin. The other passengers weren't just spectators either. They were part of the unfolding drama. Some were glued to their screens, scrolling furiously through comments. Others were shifting uncomfortably in their seats, as if they too could feel the weight of what was happening, the intensity of the moment building. David knew that the way the story would be told, the way it would be framed, it was all happening now, and somehow he was at the center of it. Was this just an accident, a passing moment? Or had he become part of the very narrative he was supposed to be recording? He could feel the judgment of the viewers already forming. Was he complicit in this moment? He wasn't sure anymore. The initial rush, the thrill of witnessing something real, had worn off, replaced by the sinking feeling of being trapped in a world where the lens you used to capture the truth could distort it as easily as it captured it. The phone had become an anchor around his neck. The comments were so loud they seemed to drown out the small voices in his head, the ones asking him what it all meant. What was he doing? He wasn't sure if he was a witness, a participant, or a perpetrator. But in the middle of that uncertainty, one thing was clear. He was no longer an outsider. The moment had swept him into its wake, and there was no going back. The story was no longer just his to witness. It was his to shape.
The stillness in the cabin was almost unbearable now. Everything was muted. The low hum of the engines, the quiet shifting of passengers in their seats, the distant conversations that had once seemed so natural now felt like whispers from another time. Kendra stood, her posture immaculate, her spine a straight line of quiet determination. She moved with purpose, slow, but each step was deliberate, as though she were walking into the heart of the storm. And yet somehow the storm seemed to bend around her. She didn't hurry, she didn't rush. She was not trying to escape anything, not trying to get away from the growing tension or the digital storm that had already consumed them all. No, she was here to assert control, to reclaim something that had long been taken from her. Her gaze flickered briefly to the captain, then back to Jenna. The room had already felt smaller, the air thicker with the weight of what was unfolding. Kendra didn't need to speak loudly to be heard. Her presence was enough. "Verify it now," Kendra said, her voice barely above a whisper, but the words held a weight that was impossible to ignore. It wasn't just a command, it was an invitation to action. It was a call to authority, and it echoed across the cabin with a quiet force that made even the captain pause. For a moment, time itself seemed to stretch, an infinite second between the word and the action. The captain, now fully aware of the gravity of the situation, hesitated. There was no escape now. This wasn't just about a seat or a ticket. This was about something far larger. The shift in power had been subtle, but the air had thickened, and Jenna's grip on the situation had started to slip moment by moment.
The captain finally nodded, his face taut with a mix of uncertainty and compliance, as he signaled for the attendant to verify Kendra's ticket. His gesture was small, but it was also a seal of fate, one that couldn't be undone. The dynamic had shifted, and no one in the cabin, not even Jenna, could deny it now. Kendra didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She didn't need to.
she had already won. Not with a slap, not with words, not with gestures, but with something far more powerful. Absolute, unshakable calm. The authority that came not from a loud declaration, but from knowing she was in control, even when no one else was. Jenna's body stiffened, her pulse quickening, as the realization slowly settled like a heavy weight on her chest. She had always prided herself on her ability to control the room, to manipulate the environment and the people within it. It was how she had risen in her career, how she had carved a place for herself in a world where she was often seen as too much, too loud, too assertive, too confident. But that had always been her power, and she had wielded it without hesitation. But now it felt like the walls were closing in. Her hands, once steady, now trembled at her sides. She could feel the sweat gathering at the back of her neck, a feeling she was far too familiar with, but had long since buried beneath layers of calculated confidence. Her control was slipping. She could sense it, feel it in the pit of her stomach, the rising tide of panic that threatened to flood her mind.
Her eyes flicked briefly between the captain, Kendra, and the passengers, now fully aware, now witnesses. And for the first time, the sense of being watched felt oppressive, suffocating. The camera, once a tool of dominance, now felt like an extension of her anxiety. Her hand shook slightly as she gripped it, her thumb hovering over the screen, unsure whether to continue recording this moment, unsure whether to continue controlling this narrative or to let it unravel completely. The cracks were showing. The calm, confident veneer she had built over the years was shattering before her eyes, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. She could feel the weight of everyone's gaze, a pressure she had never had to bear before. In the space between her fingers and the screen, she could feel the distance growing between herself and the victim of her own making. Kendra wasn't a victim. She wasn't shying away. She wasn't shrinking under the weight of Jenna's words, her slap, her attempts at dominance. Kendra was rising, calmly, unapologetically. Jenna's face flushed, the heat of humiliation creeping up her neck. She had crossed a line, and there was no turning back now. The reflection of her face in the screen, the tight lips, the widened eyes, the vulnerable edges of her carefully constructed arrogance was all too clear. She had made a choice, and now it was time to face the consequences. She had pushed too far, and the room was not just watching her. They were watching her fall. Her hand trembled as the camera shook, the once sturdy tool in her grasp, now a trembling symbol of her unraveling. The weight of the moment, the weight of the public scrutiny she had inadvertently invited, was too much for her to bear. She tried to find some semblance of composure, some control, but it was slipping through her fingers like sand, impossible to grasp. The transformation that began on that plane didn't end the moment the door closed behind Kendra. In fact, it was only just beginning. The immediate aftermath, the chaos of the viral video, the social media storm that had consumed every corner of the internet, was like a fleeting moment compared to the long-lasting impact of Kendra's quiet but relentless influence.
After the dust had settled, the cameras stopped rolling and the audiences moved on. Kendra didn't step into the spotlight. She didn't need to. It wasn't her style, and it wasn't her battle. She had never been the type to make grand gestures or demand the world's attention. Her strength lay not in how loud she could be, but in how deeply she could cut with quiet precision. It was her actions that spoke volumes, not the dramatics of the moment, but the foundation she was quietly building beneath the surface. Behind the scenes, as the legal teams at the airline scrambled to contain the fallout, the true measure of Kendra's influence began to take shape. She didn't wield a megaphone. She didn't issue public statements about retribution or personal victory. No. What Kendra did next was far more powerful.
She set about crafting the long-term change she knew would outlast any viral video, outlast any single moment. The airline's legal team, under her quiet influence, began rolling out new policies. It started with the mandated diversity training for all staff members, a program that had been discussed for years but never properly enforced. Training wasn't just about checking a box, it was about confronting the real biases, the underlying racial profiling that permeated the system, whether overt or subtle. It was about creating a new culture of respect, one that didn't just tolerate diversity, but actively embraced it. Then came the verification protocols, a new measure to ensure that every customer was treated with respect, regardless of their appearance or background. It wasn't just about ticketing systems, it was about rewriting the rules of engagement, changing the very framework in which passengers and employees interacted, where everyone had the right to feel safe, heard, and valued. These changes were not just about an isolated incident. They were Kendra's quiet refusal to allow this moment of injustice to pass without doing something real. The company, once so proud of its image, now found itself scrambling to adapt to Kendra's influence. They had a choice: embrace the shift or risk being left behind in a world that was changing faster than they had ever anticipated. But Kendra wasn't interested in what they would do. She wasn't going to allow the systemic complacency to continue. She didn't need to shout about it. She didn't need to fight in the traditional sense. She had already begun the work of systemic change. It was subtle, it was quiet, but it was relentless, and it was going to force the airline and the entire industry to reckon with its history and its future. The apology, when it came, was swift, almost too swift. The timing was calculated, the message rehearsed to perfection. It hit the airwaves within hours, tailored to diffuse the scandal that had been so perfectly captured in that viral video. The CEO, dressed in his crisp suit, delivered the apology with the practiced precision of a corporate machine. "We deeply regret the actions that took place aboard Flight 258. Our commitment to inclusivity and respect for all passengers is unwavering, and we are taking immediate action to ensure this doesn't happen again." It was the right move. It had to be. In the face of a public relations crisis, the airline's apology was the necessary step, but even in its well-polished delivery, there was a flavor of insincerity. The passengers who had watched the situation unfold, who had witnessed the human impact of Jenna's behavior and Kendra's poise, weren't fooled by the corporate gloss. They could feel the shift. They knew that something had changed, not just in the airline's policies, but in the power dynamics of the world they inhabited.
The apology was not just about admitting to a single incident. It had broader implications. Kendra's actions had made this more than a personal battle. It had become a turning point in the industry. What had started as a single video, a flash of emotional intensity captured on a phone, had evolved into something more, something that couldn't be packaged up and dismissed. It had become a movement. For the airline, it was an emergency response. For Kendra, it was the natural consequence of her quiet resolve. This wasn't a victory born of spectacle, but one forged in real, meaningful action. The apology wasn't the end. It was simply another signpost on the journey she had set into motion. The airline's quick action made it clear that they recognized the magnitude of the shift in public perception. The hashtag that had once been a digital call to arms, something that could easily be dismissed as the next viral trend, had now become a demand for change that was too big to ignore. Kendra wasn't just influencing the airline, she was influencing the narrative, and that narrative had already begun to spiral outward, impacting everyone who had witnessed that moment. The shift was not just a single policy change or a reform within one company. It was a signal to the broader world that the time for complacency was over. The flight had landed, the plane had emptied, the engines had powered down, and the world outside the cabin had continued to turn. But for those who had witnessed the confrontation between Kendra and Jenna, nothing felt the same. They had all, in their own way, been forever marked by the events that unfolded in that small space at 30,000 feet. And the changes weren't as immediate as they might have expected. These shifts in perspective crept up on them, quietly taking root in their minds, showing themselves in unexpected ways over time. The transformations weren't just about the incident itself. They were about the quiet unraveling of what they had once considered acceptable, the recognition of their own complicity, and the realization that everything had changed.
David had been the one to capture the moment. It had started so simply, a recording, a way to document an incident. But as time went on, it became clear that his role in this story was not as innocent as he had initially thought. He had filmed, sure, but had he truly witnessed? Had he been complicit? These questions gnawed at him in the hours and days that followed, long after the viral video had run its course. At first, there had been the rush of the viral clip, the sense that he was part of something important, something newsworthy. He had been capturing the truth, after all, hadn't he? But the more he reflected, the more he realized that he had been more than just a passive observer. In a way, he had become a part of the spectacle. The more the video was shared, the more the moment became consumed by others, the more he began to feel uncomfortable in his own skin. David had been passive in his decision to film. He hadn't intervened, hadn't spoken up, hadn't used his position to act with compassion. Instead, he had contributed to the exploitation of Kendra's moment. His actions had unknowingly intensified the drama. It wasn't just the act of filming that bothered him, it was the realization that, in doing so, he had allowed a woman's moment of pain to become something larger, something consumed for entertainment. As the days passed, his guilt slowly transformed into something more meaningful. David began to realize that simply witnessing wasn't enough. He started using his platform, the very one that had amplified the video, to share his reflection. He spoke openly about the responsibilities of being a witness in a world that craves spectacle. He started advocating for empathy, not just in words, but in action. He shared articles, started conversations, encouraged people to use their platforms to educate, not exploit. He used his voice to turn his regret into a call for others to think deeply about how they chose to engage with the world. His transformation wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was real.
David's change was subtle. He hadn't set out to be a leader, but his reflection led him to influence others in a quiet, impactful way. He had moved from passive participation to active responsibility, and in doing so, he had started the work of creating a more compassionate world, starting with himself. Maria had always been one to keep to herself, to stay quiet, to remain in the background. She had always been the kind of person who would look the other way, who would avoid getting involved, who would shrink back rather than confront discomfort. But this time, this moment, this reality had shaken her in a way that left her feeling raw. Watching the injustice unfold before her, seeing Kendra's unbroken calm in the face of blatant disrespect, it made Maria question something fundamental within herself. Why hadn't she done anything? She hadn't stepped in. She hadn't spoken up. She hadn't raised a hand to help, to intervene. She had been quiet. Too quiet, because that's what she always did. She had always believed that it wasn't her place to get involved, that she didn't have the right to make waves. But now, after what she had seen, that excuse didn't feel as valid anymore. The silence had weighed on her for days. It wasn't just about the incident, it was about her own inaction. In her quiet reflection, Maria realized that staying silent had been a form of complicity. She was a part of the system that allowed these things to happen, even if she didn't actively contribute to it. And that realization changed her at her core. Maria didn't want to live in a world where her silence meant inaction, where passivity allowed injustice to thrive. She couldn't undo what had happened, but she could start from this moment forward. Maria began researching, reading, talking to people, asking questions. She started to think about how she could create real change, how she could ensure that other people wouldn't make the same mistake she had.
She founded a diversity consultancy, focusing on equipping professionals in the aviation industry with the tools they needed to prevent situations like the one she had witnessed. She began to work with companies, advising them on how to foster inclusive environments, how to train staff, how to intervene in real time. Her transformation wasn't just about becoming vocal. It was about teaching others how to act before something terrible had the chance to escalate. Maria no longer felt the pull of silence. She was learning to use her voice, to help others find their strength, just as she had found hers. Margaret had always been the quiet one, the one who sat back, who nodded politely, who listened but didn't act. She was the one who would comment under her breath to her husband about things she thought were wrong but never spoke up when it mattered. She had lived her life believing that small voices didn't matter, that her opinions were just that, opinions, not to be acted upon. But after witnessing Kendra's composed strength, Margaret realized that her own passivity was a choice, one she had made without even thinking about it. She had always believed that change happens somewhere else, with someone braver, bolder, more equipped to handle conflict. But now, after seeing Kendra's quiet defiance, she knew something had shifted inside of her. Margaret realized that she too had a responsibility. She wasn't powerless. She wasn't just a spectator in this world. She had a voice, a perspective, and she could use them to make a difference. The question was, how?
So she joined the Passenger Advisory Board, a platform that allowed her to advocate for systemic change within the airline industry. She pushed for better training, for stronger policies on diversity and inclusivity, for clear accountability when incidents of racial profiling occurred. Margaret's transformation wasn't about becoming an activist overnight. It was about finding her own voice in a world that had conditioned her to believe she had nothing valuable to add. Margaret used her newfound platform to demand change where she had once stayed silent. Her evolution was a reminder to herself that passivity was a choice, just as much as action. Margaret no longer allowed herself to be invisible. She became part of the conversation, part of the solution. And in that transformation, she found a new sense of empowerment that was quieter, but no less powerful. The steady buzz of the city beyond her office windows seemed like the distant hum of normality, the world continuing to turn, oblivious to the transformation happening inside. But in that quiet moment, Kendra knew that everything had changed. Her hands, steady and deliberate, skimmed over the latest report on her desk. It was simple at first glance, just numbers, just figures. But those numbers told a story of long-term change and reformed systems that now stretched throughout the company she had quietly reshaped. The diversity dashboard was no longer a theoretical concept. It was real, with measurable shifts that were visible across the company's ranks.
The new reporting tools, those seemingly simple mechanisms, had changed the way the organization operated. Employees who once feared retaliation when speaking out now had solid, protected avenues to report discrimination. It wasn't just talk anymore. It was action, systemic action that had already begun to alter the company's entire culture. And then there was the hotline, a fixture in every employee's mind, an unshakable symbol of the changes that Kendra had quietly ushered into place. This wasn't a corporate makeover driven by the latest trends. This was a complete overhaul of systems that had failed to treat people with respect for far too long. Kendra didn't need the media circus or the applause of social media. The real change was happening behind the scenes, in the quiet corners where policy met action. And as she sat there, looking at the report, Kendra's gaze never wavered. The company was finally waking up. The numbers were the proof, but the reality of the change was far deeper than anything the report could capture. For Kendra, this moment wasn't about taking victory laps. It wasn't about being acknowledged for doing what was right. It was about knowing that she had created a shift, that the humiliation, the abuse of power, and the silencing of voices would never be allowed to take root again. Her mind wandered back to the flight, the moment that had started it all. She'd never set out for public glory, but when the moment arrived, she chose to act. And in that action, she had become a part of something larger, a quiet, unstoppable force for justice.
Her eyes shifted, landing on the blue hotline sticker on the wall opposite her desk. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't designed for attention, but it held immense significance. A small sticker, a subtle symbol of the monumental changes Kendra had driven, and yet it stood as the most visible marker of the systemic shift she had fought for. It wasn't just a number to call. It was a reminder, a commitment to never allow anyone to be silenced again. The sticker wasn't just a feature of the office. It was the living embodiment of everything she had worked for. In the days following the viral video, there had been a rush to fix the damage, to rebuild the company's reputation. But Kendra knew that fixing the symptoms wasn't enough. What had happened that day was a reflection of a broken system, and the change she had set in motion wasn't about patching up the cracks. It was about reshaping the foundation. The hotline, subtle and quiet in its presence, had become a beacon of accountability. It was the place where those who were marginalized could be heard, where systemic issues could be reported without fear, and where change had a clear path forward. Kendra's vision was no longer about making noise. It was about creating institutional change, the kind that would take years to fully unfold, but the kind that would never go away. Kendra didn't have to wait for the world to recognize her triumph. The impact was already visible. Employees across departments began to notice the changes, not just in policy, but in atmosphere. There was less fear in their conversations, more confidence in the workplace, and a shift toward genuine inclusivity. The culture had begun to change, not through grand declarations, but through consistent action and consequences. People had seen the change, they had felt it in their day-to-day lives, and it wasn't just talk, it was real, tangible, lived experience.
Kendra understood that real change didn't happen in the spotlight. It happened on the ground, with day-to-day interactions, with conversations in break rooms, and with employees who now felt empowered to speak up. The hotline wasn't just a tool, it was a safeguard, a promise that the company had made to every employee. And that promise wasn't just about following the letter of the law. It was about creating an environment where every voice, every individual was valued, no matter who they were or where they came from. This victory wasn't about one person, one incident, or one policy change. It was about restructuring the way things were done. It was about setting a new precedent, one that would guide the company and the industry for years to come. The system had been altered, and though there would always be more work to do, the change was irreversible now. Kendra didn't need to be at the center of this moment. She had never sought the spotlight.
What mattered was not who led the charge, but that the charge had been made, that the changes had already taken root. She closed the report, her gaze still lingering on the hotline sticker. It was a quiet victory, and it was one that she would carry with her, just as it would quietly carry forward. The shifts in culture, the policies put in place, and the mindsets that had been changed were the true victories. This wasn't about being seen. It was about ensuring that no one else would ever have to face the same injustice again. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.